You were told a lie about what happened in the frozen mud of the Western Front, a fairy tale designed to soften the edges of a brutal reality. For decades, history books have branded the Christmas Truce of 1914 as a spontaneous miracle of human kindness, a moment where men laid down their rifles to share cigarettes and songs in no man's land. But while you were taught this story of unity, there was another truth hidden behind the lines. One that would have cost these soldiers their lives if it had been whispered aloud. For the generals in the high command, the truce wasn't a miracle. It was a catastrophic betrayal of the war effort. To the men in the mud, it was an olive branch. To the men in the high-ranking offices, it was a total collapse of discipline and a terrifying breach of the front. Every handshake was a strategic failure. Every shared joke was a desertion of duty. The generals watched from afar as the machinery of war ground to a halt, not by choice, but by the sheer weight of human connection. They didn't see a miracle. They saw an insurrection of the spirit that threatened to dismantle their entire campaign. You have to ask yourself, whose version of history survived? The one that heals the soul, or the one that keeps the gears of war turning? You are suffocating in a space so small it feels like a tomb, where the very air has been weaponized against your lungs. Imagine standing in a frozen trench, the mud clinging to your boots like a burial shroud, while every desperate breath you take is thick with the caustic sting of mustard gas. It burns your throat, blisters your skin, and turns your survival into a frantic race against an invisible chemical tide. In this wasteland, your life doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs entirely to the man standing in the trench beside you, the only thing separating you from total oblivion. You share his heartbeat, his fear, and his ragged gasps for oxygen. Then something impossible happens. The rhythmic, bone-shaking thud of artillery fades. The screaming of shells stops. A terrifying silence crashes down over the battlefield, heavier than any explosion. This isn't a reprieve, it is an opening. In this sudden vacuum of sound, the true danger begins to shift shape. You don't know what replaced the explosions, but you know that in the absence of noise, the rules of survival have just changed. You are forced to listen to the silence, wondering if the threat has ended or if it has simply learned how to hide. You cannot look away, because in this void, every shadow carries a new, deadly weight. Imagine standing in a landscape where every shadow hides a bullet and every breath is a gamble against certain death. You think you're looking at a momentary lull in the chaos, but look closer, you are witnessing the most devastating security breach of World War I, a crack in the armor that nearly collapsed the entire Western Front. In this theater of war, peace isn't a choice, it is a dangerous illusion. One wrong move, one lapse in vigilance. And the gears of the military machine grind to a violent halt. This wasn't just a pause in the fighting, it was a systemic failure that threatened to unravel years of strategic positioning. When the lines blurred and the defenses faltered, the very foundation of the front was at risk of total disintegration. You are seeing the exact point where the invisible architecture of war began to crumble. If this breach had been exploited further, the maps would have been redrawn by sunset. Every soldier in those trenches knew that a single moment of hesitation could mean the difference between a stalemate and a catastrophe. The tension isn't just in the explosions, it's in the terrifying realization of how close the entire operation came to total collapse. You are watching the precise second where the invincible became vulnerable, and the stakes reached their absolute peak. You are standing in a place where the very earth has been poisoned by death, and for centuries, the only rule was that no one survived it. Imagine the suffocating silence of a frozen wasteland, where every shadow hides a jagged piece of metal, and every breath feels like a gamble against the grave. On December 24, 1914, something impossible happened to shatter this reality. Thousands of German and British soldiers did the unthinkable. They stepped out from their trenches and into no man's land. This wasn't just a piece of ground, it was a deliberate graveyard, a hollowed-out wasteland designed by industrial warfare to ensure that anyone caught between the lines would never see another sunrise. Yet in a moment that defied every military doctrine of the age, the screaming whistles stopped and the frantic exchange of fire fell silent. They crossed into the mud, moving toward each other not with bayonets leveled, but with a haunting curiosity. By crossing into this forbidden zone, they weren't just walking over dirt, they were stepping into a psychological vacuum where the lines between enemy and brother began to blur. You have to wonder what went through their minds as they stood in that desolate space, a zone meant for death, suddenly transformed into a theater of human connection. They stepped into the forbidden, and for one brief moment, the machinery of war ground to a haunting, beautiful halt. Imagine standing in a frozen wasteland where the only thing separating your life from death is a thin layer of fabric and the iron will to survive. In this brutal theater of war, the line between predator and prey suddenly dissolves. They didn't just stop fighting, they exchanged cigarettes, buttons, and pieces of chocolate, treating the enemy as a mirror of themselves. Think about that for a second. In a conflict designed to dehumanize them into mere targets, these soldiers chose to see the person behind the uniform, a human being who felt the same biting wind, shared the same fear of the dark, and craved the same simple comforts. When a soldier reached across the no-man's land to offer a small piece of chocolate, they weren't just making a gesture, they were dismantling a machine of hatred. Every button traded was a symbol of commonality, a silent acknowledgement that while their governments demanded blood, their hearts recognized kinship. They looked into each other's eyes and realized the person across from them wasn't a monster to be conquered, but a reflection of their own humanity. By sharing these tiny tokens of survival, they broke the cycle of violence, proving that even in the most desperate circumstances, the truth of our shared existence can override the propaganda of war. You think you're looking at a moment of profound human connection, but if you were standing in the shadows of the command center, you would see something far more terrifying. While you see a beautiful gesture, a single act of grace amidst the wreckage, the military high command saw a different reality entirely. They didn't see an individual choosing kindness, they saw an uncontrollable contagion of empathy. To them, this wasn't just one person reaching out. It was a systemic infection that threatened to rot the very foundation of the war's purpose. In their eyes, every shared look or whispered comfort acted like a wildfire in a dry forest, capable of spreading through the ranks and dissolving the discipline required to sustain a campaign. If the soldiers began to see the enemy as human, the machinery of war would grind to a violent halt. They knew that if this sentimentality took root, the chain of command would buckle, and the objective of the conflict would evaporate into nothingness. You see a miracle of the human spirit. They saw a tactical catastrophe. It was a psychological wildfire that had to be smothered before it could spread. They weren't just fighting an opposing army anymore, they were fighting a feeling. And in the cold calculus of high command, any emotion that undermined the mission was a threat that had to be neutralized immediately. You are standing in a landscape where survival is no longer a choice, but a desperate daily negotiation with death. In this desolate expanse, every scrap of material carries a weight far heavier than its physical mass. They didn't start with grand gestures or heroic alliances. They began by trading small items, buttons from uniforms, simple circles of plastic and bone that became the only currency left in a world stripped of its value. These weren't just fasteners. They were tokens of identity, pieces of a former life salvaged from the wreckage of conflict. Each exchange was a silent pact, a microscopic bridge built across a widening chasm of isolation. As these items passed from hand to hand, the transaction did something far more profound than moving goods. It forged a connection. They became literal neighbors in a wasteland of mud, their lives intertwining amidst the grey sludge and the suffocating silence of the ruins. In a place where the environment sought to erase every trace of humanity, these tiny exchanges were an act of rebellion against the void. You can see the desperation in the trade, the need for a neighbor, a witness, someone to acknowledge that they still existed. They weren't just trading buttons, they were trading pieces of their souls to ensure they wouldn't have to face the wasteland alone. Imagine standing in a frozen trench, the air thick with sulfur, realizing that the man next to you isn't just an individual. He is part of a massive, grinding machine designed to break his spirit. You might think this was just a handful of soldiers making desperate choices, but history hides a much more chilling scale. This wasn't just a few men, it was thousands across miles of the Western Front, and your understanding of why they did it is about to change completely. When you look at the geography of the front, you see a landscape defined by industrial-scale slaughter, where human lives were treated as mere statistics in a grander mathematical equation of war. Every step taken into no man's land was fueled by a psychological pressure cooker that modern observers rarely grasp. They weren't just fighting the person opposite them, they were trapped in a systemic cycle of command, geography, and survival that forced their hands to understand their actions. You have to look past the surface of the heroic narrative and see the brutal mechanics of the environment. We are going to peel back the layers of those miles of mud and wire to uncover the specific, haunting reasons why these thousands chose to endure and move forward into the very heart of the machine. Imagine standing in a frozen wasteland where your greatest enemy isn't the man behind the rifle, but the very air inside your lungs. You are shivering so violently that your teeth rattle against each other, and with every breath, the frost crystallizes on your eyelashes like tiny shards of glass. You realize then that the front lines have shifted. The soldiers weren't trying to end the war anymore. They were trying to survive a winter that was killing them faster than the bullets. In this frozen hell, a single bullet might end your life in an instant, but the cold is a slow executioner, stalking you through the trenches, stealing your heat, and turning your limbs into heavy blocks of ice. They stopped dreaming of victory or glory. Their entire world shrank down to the next hour, the next campfire, and the desperate hope for a dry pair of socks. Every soldier knew that while an enemy bullet was a choice made by a man, the freezing wind was a relentless, unfeeling force that didn't care who won or lost. They weren't fighting for territory anymore, they were fighting to keep their blood flowing. The war hadn't stopped, but the struggle had changed. Now, the only thing standing between them and an icy grave wasn't a wall of steel, it was the sheer, desperate will to stay warm enough to see tomorrow. Imagine standing in a landscape where your next breath might be your last, surrounded by a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight against your chest. In the heart of the Great War, amidst the mud and the machinery of death, something impossible began to happen. They shared songs like Still Nacht, their voices carrying across the frozen ground in a way that defied the logic of the trenches. You have to understand the sheer impossibility of those notes traveling through the air. In a theater of war designed to strip away every ounce of humanity, these melodies acted as a sonic bridge over a chasm of hatred. When they sang Still Nacht, the music didn't just travel, it pierced through the freezing mist, ignoring the lines drawn in blood and soil. It was a defiance of logic. For a few moments, the distinction between enemy and ally dissolved into the harmony of a shared hymn. You aren't just listening to a song. You are witnessing a psychological fracture in the machinery of war. These notes traveled across frozen ground that was meant only for graves, creating a haunting paradox where beauty existed in a place designed for destruction. They weren't just singing to each other, they were reclaiming their own humanity from the very earth that sought to bury it. Imagine standing in a landscape where death isn't just an abstract concept, it is a constant, suffocating presence at your doorstep. You are staring into the eyes of the person who wants to end your life before you can even blink. In this environment of absolute hostility, survival depends on your ability to process what you see. But here is the twist. Some officers on both sides actually encouraged these interactions to ease the psychological and physical toll of the front lines. They realized that the raw, brutal reality of the war was fracturing the human psyche. To keep their men from collapsing under the crushing weight of trauma, they allowed moments of forbidden connection. It wasn't a lapse in security, it was a desperate tactical decision to preserve the sanity of the soldiers. By permitting these brief, haunting exchanges across the no man's land, officers were trying to strip away the dehumanizing mask of the enemy. They knew that if a soldier could see a human face with a name and a story, the mental agony of the front lines might become bearable for just one more day. It was a dangerous gamble, a hidden truth buried in the records of the conflict, where the only way to survive the horror of war was to momentarily acknowledge the humanity shared by those on both sides of the line. You are standing in a landscape where the line between life and death is no longer a border, but a blur. In the mud-slicked expanse of no man's land, something unthinkable began to happen, a fracture in the very foundation of modern conflict. Look closely at the trenches. As soldiers from opposing sides began to share drinks and engage in desperate games of football amidst the craters, the rules of war weren't just being broken, they were being systematically dismantled. You have to understand the gravity of this shift. These men weren't just breaking a command, they were dismantling the psychological architecture of the conflict itself. Every shared bottle of alcohol and every frantic kick of a ball became an act of defiance against the machinery of death that demanded they remain enemies. By stepping into the grey zone, these soldiers created a haunting paradox. How can you maintain a war when the men on both sides realize they share the same exhaustion, the same fear, and the same humanity? This wasn't just camaraderie, it was a silent erosion of the barriers designed to keep them separated by ideology. They were carving out a secret space where the rules no longer applied, forcing the world to watch as the definitive lines of the battlefield began to dissolve into the very dirt they fought upon. You are looking at a moment of profound deception, a calculation where your perception of peace is nothing more than a mask for a much more desperate, immediate survival instinct. You might think they wanted a permanent peace, but their primary goal was simply human connection before the next volley started. Imagine standing in that corridor, the air thick with cordite and the metallic tang of fear. To an outside observer, it looks like a ceasefire. To those inside, it is a frantic grab for one last moment of humanity before the machinery of war resumes its grind. They weren't trying to stop the war, they were trying to remember what it felt like to be human before the next volley started. This isn't just a historical footnote, it's a psychological window into how the human mind clings to connection when the threat of annihilation is only seconds away. Every handshake, every shared glance, and every whispered word was a frantic attempt to bridge the void between two sides who were about to be torn apart by the same heavy metal. They weren't negotiating for future, they were anchoring themselves to the present. When you realize that their goal wasn't to end the conflict, but simply to feel something real before the next volley started, the tragedy of the moment shifts from political strategy to raw, desperate survival. You are looking at a defiance so absolute that it threatened to dismantle the very foundations of power held by two global empires. Imagine standing in the shadow of an uprising that didn't just challenge a law, but shattered the illusion of control. The sheer scale of this defiance terrified the high command in London and Berlin alike. These weren't just local rebels, they were a systemic fracture, a crack in the granite foundation of the established order. In the war rooms of London, generals watched with growing dread as the movement spread like wildfire through the ranks, turning their strategic maps into useless pieces of paper. Simultaneously, across the channel, the architects of power in Berlin felt the same chilling tremor, a realization that their grip on authority was slipping. They didn't just see a rebellion, they saw an unstoppable tide of human will that ignored their commands and defied their borders. Every decree issued from these two capitals was met with a wall of silent, resolute resistance. The scale was no longer a mere spark, it was a conflagration. For the high command, the terror wasn't just in the size of the crowd, but in the realization that they were losing the ability to dictate reality. They were watching their influence evaporate in real time, forced to face a defiance they could neither contain nor comprehend. Imagine looking into the eyes of the person across the trench and realizing they aren't a target, they are a mirror. You have been told for months that the man in the opposite uniform is a monster, a shadow, a nameless threat to your survival. But in the mud of reality, a terrifying truth begins to surface, cracking the foundation of the entire war machine. They realized that if soldiers stopped seeing each other as monsters, they would stop obeying orders to kill them. This isn't just a psychological shift, it is a systemic collapse of control. When you recognize a shared humanity, a common fear, a similar love for home, a shared pulse of adrenaline, the propaganda evaporates like mist in the morning sun. The command structure relies entirely on dehumanization. If the enemy becomes a human being with a name and a face, the word order loses its teeth. Once that mental barrier breaks, the machinery of war grinds to a halt because the psychological distance required for mass violence vanishes. They knew that a soldier who sees a brother instead of a beast is a soldier who can no longer be used as a tool of destruction. The moment they chose empathy over ideology, the invisible chains of command began to shatter, exposing the fragile lie that keeps the gears of conflict turning. You are standing in a landscape where the rules of survival have been rewritten, and what you're about to witness isn't just a moment of holiday cheer. It is a systemic collapse of the very gears that drive human conflict. Look closely at the faces involved. Notice how the tension evaporates. This wasn't just a holiday miracle. To call it a simple celebration would be to ignore the profound, underlying mechanics of human behavior. What actually occurred was a total breakdown of the psychological machinery of war. For months, the machinery had been grinding, a cycle of fear, dehumanization, and cognitive fortification designed to keep the gears of violence turning. But in this specific moment, those internal defenses didn't just crack, they disintegrated. The war machine relies on isolating the individual from their common humanity, creating a mental fortress where the enemy is no longer a person, but a target. When that realization hits, when the shared experience of survival outweighs the manufactured ideology of conflict, the psychological gears seize up and grind to a halt. You are seeing the exact point where the invisible scripts of aggression lose their power over the human mind. It is a rare, documented fracture in the system, proving that even the most hardened machinery of war can be dismantled by a single, profound realization of shared existence. You think you know what true danger feels like, but imagine standing in a wasteland where the very ground beneath your boots is trying to swallow you whole. You look around and see the immediate threat, the men in the mud, their faces masked by grime, weapons gripped in trembling hands as they face a physical enemy. They are fighting for survival in the dirt, but that is only the surface of the nightmare, because while the soldiers faced the elements, a much more calculated, invisible threat was looming just beyond their line of sight. The truest danger didn't come from the men in the mud, it came from those who watched from the command tents. From behind heavy canvas and maps, figures sat in shadows, making decisions that would decide who lived and who became a statistic. These weren't warriors, they were architects of fate, turning human lives into moves on a chessboard, while the soldiers fought for their next breath. Those in the tents were calculating the cost of their victory, or the price of their failure. They held the power to end a life with a single stroke of a pen, far removed from the mud and the blood. You might think safety lies in distance, but in this game, the person who controls the information is always more dangerous than the man holding the blade. You think you know what keeps a commander awake at night, but the truth is far more chilling than simple frustration. It's the sudden, paralyzing realization that the weapons you once mastered are no longer under your command. For these generals, the peace treaty wasn't just a diplomatic inconvenience, it was a psychological nightmare. They weren't merely annoyed by the truce, they were terrified by the absolute loss of control over their tools of war. Imagine holding a blade that suddenly becomes heavy and unresponsive in your grip, or commanding a machine that refuses to obey your signal. To these men, the soldiers, the weaponry, and the scorched earth of the battlefield weren't just resources, they were extensions of their own will. The moment the ink dried on that truce, those tools were ripped from their hands and handed to a higher authority. Every soldier became an unpredictable variable. Every weapon a potential threat to the establishment, and every maneuver a risk they could no longer calculate. They stared at the maps and saw not a pause in fighting, but a vacuum of power where their absolute grip once resided. They knew that if they couldn't control the instruments of destruction, they were no longer the masters of the theater. They were merely spectators to a new, unpredictable order rising in the silence. Imagine your commander looking directly into your eyes, and in that split second, you realize his kindness isn't a choice, it's a liability. In the high-stakes theater of total war, every smile is a crack in the armor, and every friendly gesture is being meticulously logged by those watching from the shadows. They aren't just looking for mistakes, they are hunting for the rot of empathy that leads to the collapse of an entire front. Every soft word spoken to a soldier. Every moment of shared humanity was recorded not as a leader's warmth, but as a catastrophic failure of discipline. To the high command, these gestures were data points in a grim calculation. How much softness does it take before a soldier decides that staying is no longer worth the cost? They watched for the specific moment a gesture of kindness could trigger a chain reaction of mass desertion or a total surrender. You aren't just being judged on your tactical decisions. You are being weighed on your ability to suppress your own humanity to maintain the machine. One misplaced word can be interpreted as an invitation to lay down your arms. The logs don't show kindness. They map out the exact points where the spirit of the ranks could crumble, turning a gesture into a death sentence for the unit's resolve. Imagine for a moment that your survival depends entirely on your ability to identify a target, and then in a single heartbeat, that distinction is stripped away from you forever. In the brutal calculus of war, there is a line drawn in the dirt between the enemy and a person, and crossing it means everything changes. To the high command, a soldier who shared a drink with an enemy was a soldier who could no longer be used to fire a rifle at one. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a fatal chemical shift in their utility as a weapon of war. The moment that glass touched their lips and they exchanged words over a shared drink, the invisible wall of dehumanization crumbled. To the generals in the bunkers miles away, these soldiers were assets, tools designed to be sharpened and deployed. But once that human connection sparked, the tool became broken in the eyes of the machine. They could no longer be trusted to pull the trigger because they had seen the humanity beneath the uniform. By sharing a drink, they traded their status as an obedient instrument of destruction for something far more dangerous to the establishment: empathy. The high command didn't see a moment of peace. They saw a malfunction in the system that rendered a soldier unusable, obsolete, and ultimately, untouchable by the state's objectives. You are being watched by a tradition that isn't just a holiday. It is a psychological siege designed to occupy your very identity. They knew that if the spirit of Christmas took root, it would become an unbreakable cultural cornerstone, a permanent shift in how you perceive community and celebration. But they couldn't let it stay pure. To maintain control, they had to find a way to repoison the minds of the men before that spirit could become permanent. Imagine the calculated strategy involved, a systematic infiltration of the narrative to ensure that your devotion wasn't to the season itself, but to the specific curated symbols they chose for you. They weren't just fighting a calendar, they were fighting a psychological shift in the male psyche. If those men remained untainted by the underlying agenda, the movement would have lost its grip. Every ornament, every ritual, and every tradition was a calculated move to distract you from the truth of what was being installed. They had to act fast because once that spirit becomes permanent, it is nearly impossible to extract. You aren't just celebrating, you are participating in a psychological landscape that was meticulously redesigned to ensure your loyalty stayed exactly where they wanted it. The clock was ticking, and the mission was clear: neutralize the purity of the season to ensure its lasting. Manufactured grip on your mind. You think you are standing on solid ground, but beneath your feet, the floor is about to vanish. You believe you have reached a moment of tranquility, a sanctuary of peace, but what you are actually entering is a sophisticated trap designed to strip away everything you thought was yours. This isn't just a change in tone, it is a fundamental fracture in the reality you've been told. This is where the narrative shifts from a story of peace to a story of calculated, brutal reindoctrination. Every comfort you just felt was merely a sedative, intended to lower your defenses before the machinery of control begins to grind against your will. They aren't just changing the rules, they are rewriting your very identity. Notice how the atmosphere thickens. The words are no longer inviting you in, they are pinning you down. Each step forward isn't an evolution toward freedom, but a deliberate march into a psychological cage. They are stripping away your autonomy piece by piece, replacing your memories with their script and your choices with their commands. You won't see the walls closing in until they are already too high to climb over. The piece was a lie designed to make you compliant. The reindoctrination is the reality of what happens when the mask finally falls away. Pay attention, because once this process begins, there is no turning back. You think you know what war looks like, but you've been lied to about the true cost of survival. Imagine the world in 1915, a year that would shatter the collective psyche of an entire generation. For a brief moment, there was a haunting, fragile romance in the truces, a desperate, flickering hope that the bloodshed might be halted by some unspoken agreement between empires. But that fantasy was about to be incinerated by the cold machinery of modern progress. The The romanticized notions of glory and chivalry didn't just fade, they were systematically crushed under the weight of industrial slaughter. By the time the guns turned toward Verdun and the Somme, the battlefield had transformed into a factory of death. This wasn't just a clash of men, it was the birth of industrialized carnage. At Verdun, the earth itself was pulverized, turning soldiers into statistics in a meat grinder of artillery fire. On the Somme, the scale of devastation reached a point that defied human comprehension, where miles of trenches became tombs and the very soil soaked up the blood of millions. The romance died in the mud. What remained was a grim, terrifying reality. The realization that technology had outpaced human morality, creating a cycle of destruction so vast, it changed the definition of war forever. You are staring at a logistical nightmare where every second of hesitation translates directly into a loss of life. Imagine the ground beneath your feet turning into a graveyard of stalled machinery and frozen ambition. The commanders looked out over the horizon and saw the terrifying reality. If they didn't break the connection, the war wouldn't just stall, it would vanish into the mire. They were fighting against more than an opposing army, they were fighting the very earth itself. Every mile of supply line was a lifeline of survival, but that line was fraying under the weight of the elements. If those links remained intact, the machinery of war would grind to a halt in the mud, turning soldiers into stationary targets and supplies into useless heaps of rust. The commanders understood the math of survival. A broken connection meant they could still move, still fight, and still win. A preserved connection meant a stalemate where the only thing moving was the encroaching cold. They had to sever the ties to force a decisive movement, knowing that any hesitation would condemn their forces to be swallowed by the sludge of history. The tension was no longer about tactics on a map. It was about the desperate, frantic race to outrun a geographic trap before the mud claimed everything they had left to fight for. Imagine standing on a battlefield where your primary senses are suddenly stripped away, replaced by a terror so absolute it erases the very concept of human connection. You aren't just facing an opponent anymore. You are facing an invisible, impersonal machine designed to delete your existence from the record of history. They didn't just want to win a war. They intentionally engineered new tactics, long-range artillery and chemical weapons, specifically to ensure no man could ever see his enemy's face again. Think about that shift in intent. In earlier centuries, combat was intimate. It was eye-to-eye, hand-to-hand, a visceral exchange of human proximity. But these innovations fundamentally rewrote the rules of survival. By moving the point of impact miles away and replacing lead with toxic clouds, they stripped the human out of the conflict. The goal was a total psychological severance. When an artillery shell strikes from over the horizon, there is no individual to blame, no face to hate, and no person to negotiate with, only a sudden, devastating impact that renders the target anonymous before it even falls. By weaponizing distance and chemistry, they created a veil of anonymity where death became industrial. They didn't just want to defeat their rivals. They wanted to ensure that by the time the final blow landed, the very idea of a human face was gone forever. Imagine a world where your survival instinct is systematically dismantled by an invisible hand. You aren't just facing an enemy, you are being rewritten. By stripping away the human element from the battlefield, they achieved something chillingly effective. They successfully cured the soldiers of their desire for peace. Think about that word, *cure*. It implies that the longing for home, for safety, and for life beyond the mud and the metal was viewed not as a human right, or even a weakness, but as a biological defect to be surgically removed from the psyche. When you remove the face of the enemy and replace it with an abstract objective, the internal alarm bells that scream, retreat, are silenced forever. The machinery of war doesn't want men who hesitate, it wants vessels of pure intent. By isolating the soldier from the human consequences of their actions, they engineered a psychological transformation where the only remaining goal is the completion of the task. They didn't just train these men to fight, they re-engineered their minds so that the very concept of peace became unrecognizable, a ghost in the machine that was scrubbed away until only the mission remained. You are no longer looking at individuals seeking a way out. You are watching the result of a systematic psychological overhaul where the human heart is traded for an unwavering, mechanical resolve. You think you know what separates a soldier from a civilian, but what if I told you that the line between total annihilation and sudden peace is thinner than a heartbeat? You might believe the 1914 truce was buried under a century of dust, a mere footnote in a textbook, but it remains the ultimate evidence of how fragile war truly is when faced with shared humanity. Imagine the atmosphere, the deafening roar of artillery suddenly falling silent, replaced by a void so heavy it feels like physical pressure on your chest. In those moments, the machinery of hatred grinds to a mechanical halt. It wasn't just a pause in fighting, it was a fracture in the logic of conflict. When soldiers from opposing sides stepped into no man's land, they weren't enemies anymore. They were men sharing bread and water, recognizing their own reflection in the eyes of the person across the trench. This isn't just a historical anecdote. It is a haunting revelation of how easily the narrative of violence can be dismantled by a single human connection. The 1914 Truce exposes the terrifying truth that war is often a choice maintained by distance and distance alone. Once that gap closes, the myth of the other evaporates, leaving behind only the raw, undeniable reality of our shared existence. You think a signed piece of paper can stop a machine built for slaughter. You might believe that a formal truce offers safety, but for the men in command, it was nothing more than a fatal lapse in judgment, a crack in the armor that they were determined to weld shut forever. The generals didn't just not forgive these truces, they viewed every moment of negotiated peace as a systemic failure, a crack in the foundation of their authority. They spent the next 4 years systematically dismantling the possibility of diplomacy. This wasn't a simple grudge or a personal slight. It was a calculated, multi-year purge of any mechanism that allowed for hesitation. They treated the very concept of a truce like a virus within the military machine, scrubbing every agreement and every promise from the record books, until only the machinery of total war remained. Every decree they issued over those 4 years served one singular purpose, ensuring such a thing could never happen again. They transformed the landscape from a theater of negotiation into a fortress of absolute resolve. By the time the dust settled, the option for peace hadn't just been ignored, it had been hunted down and erased. They didn't want to negotiate with their enemies, they wanted to ensure that the only thing left standing was the finality of their command. Imagine a world where your ability to reach out and touch another human being, to offer a simple handshake, was stripped away by the very machines of progress you thought would set you free. They didn't just win a war, they engineered a fundamental shift in how humanity survives, ensuring that by 1915, no man would ever have the chance to shake another man's hand. This wasn't an accident of history or a byproduct of conflict. It was a calculated victory of logistics over intimacy. They recognized that to dominate the landscape, they had to replace human connection with industrial output. By 1915, the gears of production and the machinery of modern warfare became the only hands left reaching out in the mud. You have to understand the gravity of what was lost in those trenches. When a man can no longer reach across the divide to grasp the hand of his neighbor, he becomes a component in a much larger, colder machine. They won by isolating the individual, turning the collective human experience into a series of disconnected movements. Every handshake lost was a victory for an ideology that valued the efficiency of the system over the touch of the person. You are looking at the moment humanity traded the warmth of a grip for the cold, undeniable power of the industrial age. You are standing on a precipice where the very definition of human survival changed forever. You have to understand that before the world fractured in 1914, the rules of engagement were still rooted in old world glory. But what emerged from the mud was something far more calculated, colder, and infinitely more lethal. It wasn't just a war, it was the birth of an industrial process designed to grind human life into raw statistics. If you want to see how the machine of modern warfare was perfected after 1914, hit subscribe for our next deep dive into the tactics of attrition. We aren't just looking at history, we are decoding the blueprint of a system that transformed soldiers into components and courage into a measurable resource. You need to see how the gears of this machine turned, grinding down entire nations until only the strongest remained. Every trench, every shell, and every tactical maneuver was a calculated step toward perfecting a method of winning through exhaustion, a systematic mathematical erosion of the human spirit. Don't look away, because understanding these mechanics is the only way to grasp how the world we live in today was forged in those fires. The secrets of 1914 are still hidden in the gears of modern strategy. Stay with us, and we will strip back the layers of this brutal evolution together.